All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode here of HR Heretics. I am so happy to have Chris Yeh here. I have known of and kind of known Chris. I mean, I'm not going to pretend we're friends, but I've been a fan for probably like 20 years and seen you speak a bunch of times. And so we're happy to come on and talk about all the things. I don't even know how to talk about your background because it's literally spans author, venture partner, mentor, academic instructor, co-founder, and board member. So we've got like a lot of surface area.
We got a legend on, Kelly.
I don't know how we're going to do 40 minutes, but I'm so humbled for you to have you on, Chris, and it's so good to see you again. Thank you.
It is my pleasure, and I can't remember the exact show, which was the first time that we finally got a chance to meet, but I remember we got to speak on the same panel, and I remember when I met you, I was like, oh my gosh, Kelly is awesome. I'm so glad I now have her in my life, and it's great to be here and be a part of HR Heretics.
Yeah. See, I even blanked we were on the same panel together because I was just so awestruck. I totally blacked out that I wasn't even on the panel with you. So awesome. Well, Nolan, kick us off, my friend.
Yeah. So Chris, as I've been preparing for this episode, I've been watching all of your stuff. And the thing that strikes me about you is you just have this palpable energy. Like it emanates through the screen when I watch your YouTubes. Where does that come from? And how does somebody who has been around the block as many times as you have been around still have that much juice?
So I will give it credit to a couple things. The first baseline level is, as you know, there is this notion of a set point for happiness that people have. And so mine is jammed way up, and then somebody like threw away the lever that kept it up there. So I'm just generically one of the happiest, most optimistic people you're going to meet. And that helps drive the energy. Of course, optimism and energy are not directly correlated, but there's a very strong association. The second thing I would say is that I have a long history of public speaking and performance. So when people talk to me about my academic career, I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. I studied product design engineering and creative writing, but also very critically, I studied drama and improvisational acting. I studied public speaking and then taught public speaking for the engineering school. I studied peer counseling and then was a peer counselor for years. And of course, I was part of an improv comedy troupe for a number of years as well. So from those formative years, I was learning to be on stage. And a big part of being on stage is conveying the energy that you have. And I think, Kelly, you were talking about, seeing me speak. One of the things I try to do is I tell people, listen, the audience is going to have a good time if the speaker is having a good time. And the audience is going to feel energetic if the speaker is energetic. You can't go up there, and I don't want to throw shade on my industry, but if you've ever seen venture capitalists speak on stage, the vast majority are the most boring people imaginable. Now, the funny thing is they're actually smart, fascinating individuals, but because they've got it in their mind, I'm a dignified venture capitalist, I must speak like this. Yes, we're very interested in finding companies. We like to back the best entrepreneurs, and we really do a great job of finding them. Like, no, like I love entrepreneurs. They're incredible. When I see an entrepreneur and I think that they've got it, I'm like, wow, I got to spend more time with this person. I mean, show you're excited. Don't just say you're excited.
Yep. I love that. So Alex Hermosi has this notion around passion, and he thinks passion is overrated because, like my parents used to say this to me as a kid, like, oh, go follow your passion. And his take is actually like passion comes from your acquisition of skills and then ultimately getting towards the mastery of those skills. You seem like somebody who loves what they do. Would you agree with that take, or do you disagree with that take?
I would say I largely agree, but I would put my own spin on it. So what I would say is this, that passion is not something that is just, given from on high. And it absolutely is the case that you develop passion for something. The more you do it, you develop passion for it. I never did improv before I took an improv class. And then I was like, wow, this is amazing. I hadn't done design thinking until I started studying product design. And I was like, wow, this is great. This is kind of the kind of stuff I really love. And so you've got to try these different things. You're not born with the passion. You develop the passion from actually experiencing something and hopefully getting something out of it. But what I will also say on top of that is that the reason why the take resonates with me is because far too many people are like, follow your passions. I'm like, some of your passions are useful. Some of them are not. Let's be clear about this. You got to be useful in this world.
I love that. We love a good dose of realism on this show too, Chris. So, I mean, back to the energy. It's a great question, Nolan. And, Nolan and I talked, we had an episode a while back around kind of charisma in leadership and if that's helpful. And he called it Riz. I had no idea what that was.
Yeah, Chris has Riz.
Chris has Riz.
Absolutely. Riz is the thing.
Yeah, it is a thing. And so we talked about charisma. And we talked about when you have wonderful leaders in organizations that are like these boring VC folks, but they just can't seem to get it going, and the importance of winning hearts and minds and leadership. And can you instill that? And I was like, look, you can't, totally change someone, but you can help them raise it up, get some Riz. And I don't know, I think I remember Nolan disagreeing with me on that, but I think you can deploy some hacks, if you will, to help folks do that. And I wanted to get your take on that.
100%. So here is the thing. And I think this speaks to the notion of charisma, right? So charisma is something that's not just based on performance. I actually was having a conversation online about this recently. Charisma is about the ability to connect with the audience. You could be a great performer. If you don't connect with the audience, you don't actually have charisma. You're just very loud. And so it's really about that connection. Now, can we teach people to have that connection? At some level, they're going to have a level of empathy, ability to read people. Some people are better than others at it, no question. But everyone can learn to be better, right? Everyone can learn, okay, look for these signs. This shows you that the audience is interested, right? You can see them leaning forward. You can see them not staring at their phones, right? So all these things are things that you can absolutely learn. And when I taught public speaking, we would teach specific techniques around eye contact and how you stand and how you gesture that would all help people be more charismatic. The toughest part, however, is you cannot convert an introvert into an extrovert. You can give an introvert amazing social skills and the ability to wow an audience, but you can't turn them into an extrovert. And that's the toughest part. If you're an introverted leader, you may be as charismatic as all heck, but putting that charisma out there and connecting with the audience consumes a vast amount of your energy, and you'll have to go and recharge afterwards. Whereas a 100% dyed-in-wool extrovert like me, the more audiences there are, the more excited I get, the more energetic I'll be up until the very end of the day when I crash.
Right. And the hard part I've found about you both, but I've found is in trying to instill something in someone they may not naturally have, it's very dangerous to instill it so much they become something they're not, and it just looks fake and silly. And and then they actually lose the audience more than if they were going to stand up there like a robot. So there's a slippery slope there.
Absolutely.
All right. So Chris, I watched your TED Talk, and for those that haven't seen it yet, it's around infinite learning. And I love this quote from you. You said, "We often praise people for learning new things, but I'm going to suggest that we should also praise them for unlearning old things." And you used a couple of awesome examples like the Nokia phone, the floppy disk, the headphone jack. And you go on to say that every lesson has an expiration date. Unlearning, I find, is a skill that most people are not good at. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's very simple. We as human beings don't like uncertainty. We like feeling we've got it figured out. And I know because I like feeling that I figured it out as well. I mean, I can think back to what happens on the first day of school when you are in grade school or junior high or something like that. Or maybe your first day of high school. Like, oh my God, I'm so nervous. What's going to happen? And then by the end of high school, you're like, I got this dialed in. I know what's going on. And we like that feeling of being a confident senior, not a scared freshman. But the fact is that as the world changes around us, it doesn't matter how confident we feel. We really are that scared freshman. We really do have to learn something new, because whatever worked for us in junior high or elementary school, whatever, maybe being able to make that flatulating sound with your armpit or something like that, that kills when you're in the 4th or 5th grade, probably not going to work in the 12th grade. You got to learn some new skills.
Wow. And then I guess like the next piece, so taking it towards tech companies, when you think about team building, how do you think about building a team of infinite learners?
Yes. So this is a tough one, right? And obviously, when it comes to building a team of infinite learners, part of it relies on the individuals being able to do it. But part of it is that learning is a team sport, right? We often think of learning as an individual sport, but it's really a team sport. Like when we learn, we're learning from people around us. We're not just in a silo by ourselves. So creating an environment where people are rewarded and praised for learning and unlearning, by the way, creating a place where people are encouraged to share and to, be explicit about their metacognition. Like, hey, here's why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, as opposed to just arguing positions and facts and things like that. Really focus on here's why we know what we know. I think that the right term, I use it just to sound smart, but I'm not entirely certain this is right, is epistemology.
What does that mean?
The science of knowing why we know things.
Got it.
So we love to kind of, jump into the contradictory here, Chris, and the tough, like, that sounds wonderful. And if I'm a founder, CEO, a leader, or an HR, like in these companies where I'll speak for myself, like we can't even go to the bathroom during the day half the time, let alone breathe or get stuff done. It's so under pressure to execute and meet deliverables. And now with less resources, how do you answer the question, Chris, how do I find time for that? Because that sounds wonderful, sounds very mindful. It sounds self-actualizing. How do I create time for that when we're all literally on the edge?
So there's something that I learned from my very first startup. So I started my first company in 1999 during the dot-com boom. I was literally a 25-year-old founder, CEO, what have you. And I just remember always thinking, hey, if I can just write one more email, if I can just take one more meeting, if I can just do this one more thing. And I just worked all the time. Believe me, my wife will tell you it was not a good time to be married to me. But what I eventually learned from that experience is it's like, actually, the amount of work that is available for us to do is nearly infinite. And it doesn't matter how hard we work. There's always more we didn't do. And so the principle to get things done is not to outwork everyone else and do more work and spend more time working and less time sleeping, less time interacting with others. It's to prioritize. And when you let go of the notion that you'll be able to do everything that you're supposed to do, I'm like, hey, you know what? I know there's like these things in my email inbox that I should respond to. I know there's all this stuff. And I'm like, listen, I'm going to forgive myself that I can't do everything because the world literally sends me twice as many emails as I can ever possibly humanly respond to. So I'm going to let that go. And what I'm going to do instead is say, okay, let me just be very careful and figure out what is really important. And as primitive as it sounds, what I actually do is I actually find little strips of paper and I write down the things I absolutely have to do. And I just keep them with me and I look at what's the next thing and I cross it off. That's it. Because you'll never get to everything. You'll never be able to do everything you want to do.
I love that. Because I used to be the same way, right? I was like in my 20s and just like killing myself. And I remember, I kind of let go of that about 5-6 years ago. And the thing that I had in my mind to let go of that was just make it a test, right? Make it an experiment. See what happens if you don't respond to every single Slack within 10 minutes. See who screams. See what happens if you don't do something at 10 at night and do it at 11 a.m. in the morning. Nothing really happened. And so it's funny how we create these kind of consequences in our brain. We do have more time for things like that. So that's interesting.
By the way, I want to give credit to my wife for something here, which is, one of the things that we often do, especially when we're younger, is we think we're indispensable. We think that everything will go to heck without us. It'll all fall apart. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't take a lot of vacations when I was younger. And this was even in the pre-9/11 era. So it was a lot easier to travel then. And my wife was always like, that's on you. You could have taken time off. You had the money. You had worked for a company with an unlimited vacation policy and you didn't do that. I'm like, you're right. You're 100% right. I should have done that. And so I passed that advice on to other people. No matter how indispensable you are, obviously the world can get by without you for a week or even 2. Take time off.
That's good feedback.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes. So, Chris, you wrote a book with Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn, and I'd love for us to dive into that, Nolan, with Chris, on why did you do that? How did you do that? How was that? And just some of the dynamics between you two and your philosophies.
Absolutely. So basically, the story begins that I first met Reid when he was starting LinkedIn. And I didn't know that he was going to become such an important part of my life. I just thought that this LinkedIn thing that he created was amazing. And I thought it was going to be hugely successful. Sadly, I was too young and poor to invest in the company at the time. And I was too dumb not to immediately quit my job and join the company. Now, again, that would have meant quitting my job where I was the head of marketing for a company and joining a startup in God knows what role. But rest assured, I still would have made a lot more money taking any role at LinkedIn, including janitor, than I did with the company where I was head of marketing. Anyways, I met Reid during that process and got to know him a little bit. But the person who we can really give the credit for bringing us together is my friend and our other fellow co-author, Ben Kasnoka. So Ben and I met when he was a teenager, of all things. We were commenting on the same blogs. And one day we got together, and again, I can only imagine the conversation with his parents. Hey, can I borrow the car? I'm going to go drive down the peninsula from San Francisco to go meet with my friend from the internet who's 30 years old. Doesn't sound creepy at all, right? But, we got together, we started doing like hosting intellectual salons and everything like that. And he also separately got introduced to Reid. And fast forward to, like around 2010 or so. And Ben's like, hey, do you know Reid Hoffman? I'm like, yeah, Reid's a great guy. And Ben's like, he's asking me to write a book with him. And I don't know if I should do it. I've already written a book. I don't want to be pigeonholed as an author. And I'm like, well, Ben, how many times in the past year has one of the unquestioned geniuses of the world asked you to write a book with them? He's like, well, this is the first time. I'm like, this kind of opportunity doesn't come around very often. I strongly urge you to do this. And so Ben ended up doing this, and he and Reid worked together on a book called The Startup of You. It's pretty famous, came out in 2012. And after The Startup of You came out, and I was a consultant on the book, I helped them structure it and gave them suggestions. I'm even in the book. They said, hey, would you come and meet with us? I'm like, of course. Two guys I like, no problem. I go to Reid's office at LinkedIn, and they say, hey, we've got The Startup of You out. It's really interesting, but a lot of people are asking the question, if I'm a company, how do I deal with people with this mentality? And I'm like, well, that's a really good point. You guys should really do something there. And they're like, well, actually, we were wondering if you wanted to work with us on that. Because turns out writing books is a lot of work. And you write faster than anyone else we know. And we think that you'll be able to carry a lot of this load if you work with us. And I said, okay, tell you what, guys, I have one question. They're like, what's that? Does my name appear on the cover? They're like, yes. I'm like, I'm in. They're like, what? You don't care about money or anything like that? I'm like, you guys are not going to screw me. Whatever the deal is, it's going to be more than fair. I just want to work with you guys on this because, yeah, I totally get these ideas. After all, I helped you as a consultant on the content of your previous book, and I totally get where this needs to go, and I'd be delighted to work. And so we got together. We ended up writing the book, The Alliance, and the mechanics of writing the book were that we would meet at Reid's house every Thursday morning. And we all set aside this time. We'd stay outside Thursday morning because I still had a full-time job as VP of marketing for another company. But we had Thursdays off, and with permission from the CEO of that company, I would go and actually spend the Thursday mornings with Reid because he's like, obviously, it's a great opportunity. You should do it. And also, they didn't want me to quit my job. So we would get together, and basically it was I call it a recursive process. We talk through the ideas and debate and go back and forth. And then afterwards, meanwhile, I'd be taking notes. Afterwards, I would go and separately write it into chapter form or something like that. So when people say, oh, you write the books, I'm like, well, I do all the typing. That's what I mean. And then we would go back and revise it. And there's some things that Reid is particularly good at, like coming up with headlines and things like that. Reid is actually a brilliant headline writer. If he did not have his day job as investor, co-founder, world famous, legendary entrepreneur, he could have been a great advertising copywriter, writing headlines for newspapers.
Interesting. Were there any things that you kind of went to the mat on? Any philosophies or concepts that you disagreed on? Or was it just all duckies and rainbows the whole way through, Chris?
The crazy thing is it's primarily duckies and rainbows. There's actually a reason for that. And that is because Reid and I had very similar experiences as well. That was one of the reasons why when they approached me, they said, oh, we had a long list of people, but you were first on the list. I'm like, you don't need to go to any of those other hacks. I'm in. But so both Reid and I went to Stanford as undergraduates. It was class of 1989. I was class of 1994. So there's zero overlap. But we did very similar things while we were in school. We both did something called structured liberal education, which is this very intensive intellectual humanities class, which takes up half your schedule, where you live in a dorm with other people taking the class, and where you have 2-hour discussions every day about the greatest works of philosophy, history, art, etc. And we were both part of the program. We had the same instructors for that program. And then while we were at Stanford, we both did a mix of the science and engineering side, as well as the humanities. I did product design engineering, which is mechanical engineering plus art and design thinking, as well as creative writing as part of the English department. Reid did what is now famously known as symbolic systems. It's well known in Silicon Valley because so many famous CEOs came out of the symbolic systems department at Stanford. But it's basically a mix of computer science and philosophy and linguistics. So it's that combination, much like, Steve Jobs would talk about, like the power of the humanities combined with technology and science. So we had similar backgrounds, knew similar people, and so we formed similar ideas along the way.
So Chris, I want to actually understand that, they said that you were like the fastest person for writing. What are your secrets to making yourself write very quickly?
Excellent question. The most important thing is practice. So I developed my writing speed. I was always fast, even in college. And in college, my greatest achievement, I've often referred to this one, not that often, but I've referred to it myself, is there was one particular paper I wrote for a class where I went from doing the reading on the paper to turning it in 94 minutes.
Wow. With no chat GPT, none of that.
It is also the case with no ChatGPT. I'm the original ChatGPT. It is also the case that when I was working as a head of marketing of an enterprise software company, the record I set was I once wrote a white paper in 30 minutes. So I have been very fast for a long time. But that speed was reinforced by the rise of blogging and social media. And I don't blog as much as I used to, because back then it was sort of like I didn't have other releases for my writing. I've written literally thousands of blog posts. And usually, because I was a busy person with a family and responsibilities, I'd be writing as fast as I could. And so I just developed the ability to write really quickly and not be self-conscious, right? This is the thing that slows down writing. People are self-conscious about what they're writing and saying like, oh, how did that sound? Oh, I don't know. How's this make me come off? I'm like, I got no time. Let's go.
Speaking of having no time, like I have to ask this because I'm not similar in a lot of ways, but similar where I'm like, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. Like I have like 9 part-time jobs and I love it. And I've heard you talk for the last 23 minutes and there's literally like 100 things you've done, from academia to this, to that. How did you like handle all that in your brain, Chris? Like, how did you not like let your brain explode? And how did you pick and prioritize and choose? Because you seem to be able to do anything. And even now I'm having a hard time with that every day, now that I'm out of the operating role. And like, tell us, did you get help with that? Do you have a framework in your mind? Like, what's going on?
So I sadly wouldn't say I've had help with it, although many people extol the value of coaching. I've never actually had coaching, which is probably a bad thing. I should probably get coaching. Maybe that'd be much better if I had a coach. So what I would again say is I had a lot of practice, right? Growing up, I was always balancing things because my dad has a PhD in electrical engineering. My late mother had a master's degree in library science and children's literature. So I was always reading and also doing science and math and doing all these things at once. And when I was at Stanford, same thing. I would just load myself with all sorts of things. I discovered a loophole when I was at Stanford, by the way. While I was there, they were shifting from paper-based cards to computerized systems for picking your classes. And for a brief period of time, 1 year, I realized that you could actually take classes for less units than they were offered because you had a unit limit. You could only take 20 units per quarter. So I figured out a way to, for an entire year, take 30 units a quarter by taking classes for less units than they were worth. The university caught on and closed that loophole a year later, but I did manage to get 1 year of this in. And so I was always very used to juggling and doing these various things. And for me, the main thing is not multitasking. Like people sometimes talk about multitasking. Like multitasking does not work. What I am really good at is context switching and being able to switch contexts immediately. And what I do today, by the way, this is a more recent development, but I've refined it over time. What I do is I actually use music to help me do this. So when I am sitting down to do this kind of work, what I will do is I will generally ask one of these devices that is monitoring my voice at all times. I won't say its name, so I won't set it off. And I ask it to play 1980s music. Now, the reason I do that is because science shows that the music of your youth is the thing that tends to make you feel most creative and most youthful and energetic. And I literally find that even if I'm dragging and having a hard time, you could turn on the 80s music and George Michael or Africa comes on and all of a sudden you're typing away.
Love Toto. I'm a big fan of that song, Africa. And I do the same with 90s music. I'll put it on Spotify and run. That's incredible. Chris, you've been doing all of these wonderful things since the mid 90s, and now we're 2025 pretty much. How have you stayed relevant? Like, I'd love tips and tricks because I'm getting older and I have other friends who are like, well, I'm not relevant anymore. I'm like, well, you could be. Like, how do you spend your time to do that? And what's your plan on that with AI? Because I'm sure you're doing it now with that movement, and I'd love to extract that from you.
So this is something that I recognize, going back 20 years, because I would interact with people who were our age now, and they would sound so out of touch. It was insane. I remember there was an event we were going to do in the mid 2000s, and there was a guy I knew who was maybe in his early 50s, and we're talking about the event and the music we're going to play, and I had one of my younger employees come up with a playlist. He's like, "We're not going to play any of that rap music, are you? That bip that bip that." I'm like, "Oh my God, you sound like you're 1,000 years old. Get off my lawn!" And so I'm like, I cannot let that happen to me. So what do I do to stay relevant? There are a couple things. The first, the most important thing is continue to develop friendships and relationships with people who are young or young at heart. And I jokingly say, oh, my young friends are now old. It's time to get a new set of young friends. But it's literally true. And being an instructor helps with that, right? Having a college like Stanford bring a supply of young people to me is always a very useful thing to have happen. But I have my children and I pay attention to them as well. I try to see what they're doing. And so part of it is just tapping into things that are happening that are new. And part of that for me also means keeping track, and this sounds crazy, but keeping track of popular culture, right? So I knew what I know about Riz. In earlier eras, I would know who PewDiePie was, or these days I know that, everyone's upset at Netflix because of the Mike Tyson, Jake Paul fight and the problems with the Twitch streams and everything like that. So I try to keep track of popular culture, not because it's necessarily like super relevant to the things I do, but because it's relevant to understanding what people are thinking about and what matters to them. And so I consume this. Now I try to consume it in concentrated form. Like I don't have enough time to watch every season of Real Housewives on Bravo or something like that, but I can have awareness of what Real Housewives is about.
Yeah. The spending time with young people thing, I heard first from Michael Ovitz, who's the founder of CAA. And once I heard that, it became so obvious to me. I think the other thing that you do that you didn't say is that you remain cool to young people who aspire to be in this life and this career. And I think about this all the time. I have this electric skateboard, and my neighbor is 13 years old. And every time I'm on that thing, he thinks I'm the coolest dude ever. And I think there's something about that too, to where it's just if you can also remain playful and like there's something about the kids think you're cool. I think that also keeps you young for forever.
And the most important thing about being cool, as everyone knows, is the best way to be cool is to not care about being cool. And if you don't care about being cool, then people say, that's cool.
Amen. Amen. All right. So I want to talk about blitzscaling for a second. So this is the book that you co-authored with Reid. And look, I think one of the truths about blitzscaling is that companies in this mode are constantly changing and evolving. And it makes me think that two of the most important skills to hire for when you're thinking about employees at blitzscaling companies is adaptability and resilience. How do you assess people for those skills?
So adapting and resilience, 100% agree. Those are critical. And the theme of blitzscaling and the theme of the Alliance and ultimately the theme of the Startup U is all about adaptability, which feeds neatly into the concept of being an infinite learner as well. So how do you tell if somebody is adaptable? Well, it's hard, right? One of the things that Reid has taught me over the years, and something he's mentioned a number of times, is that to assess someone, we believe in what we see with our own eyes. The problem is our own eyes lie, and it's difficult in a half-hour interview to really assess someone. And one of the things Reid says is it's far more important to go ahead and check references and talk to people who've interacted with that person for thousands of hours, because that person cannot have hidden their true self for thousands of hours. And so one of the first things is that reference checking. Ask people, talk to me about this person. Are they adaptable? Are they resilient? But then the other thing that you do when you are, because you do actually have to try to assess them anyways, right? Even though the references are more important, you just ask them, tell me about an example where you were knocked down and how you got back up. Tell me about something that you had to come back from. Tell me about a time when you thought you had learned a lesson and then you discovered it no longer applied. And the people who naturally think in adaptable ways and are resilient will have those stories easily come to mind. And the people who are not will not.
Yeah. And you wrote Blitzscaling with Reid in 2018, and fast forward 7 years later, there we go. I would argue adaptability and resilience remain, even more so potentially. Is there anything in that book, Chris, that you'd take back now, or maybe that isn't kind of as bold or underlined looking forward the next 3 years than maybe you wrote about at that time?
So I think there's some things in the book that show its age. They're primarily around sort of the world as it was then. So for example, we had a whole chapter on blitzscaling in China, because at the time, the Chinese startup ecosystem was thriving. And there were people like Mike Moritz around the time blitzscaling came out saying, hey, if you want to understand what's happening in the startup world, you got to go to China. That's where it's all happening. And then, of course, geopolitical events have occurred since then. The rulership of that country decided to intentionally crush that sector. So there are things that just seem anachronistic as we talk about the amazing power of blitzscaling in China. But what I would say is through some pretty crazy events, a global pandemic, the rise of AI, the lessons of blitzscaling seem to continue to apply, right? We did a whole bunch of stuff during the pandemic talking about blitzscaling during the pandemic. And one of the things that aged the best, because we try to make these calls publicly so that we can come back later and say, yes, you guys were right. But one of the things we did early on in the pandemic is we talked about Airbnb. And we said, here's the thing you have to understand about blitzscaling. It is relative. It is contextual. And so you look at Airbnb and you say, this is a company that has lost 100% of its revenue overnight and that had to lay off 25% of their people. You're like, how are they going to recover? And our response was, you know what they don't have? They don't have a bunch of leases and mortgages on empty hotels that they've got to pay for. In fact, the competition they're facing is hurting even worse. And if Airbnb adapts to this new reality and gains market share relative to their competition during this period, which they should be able to do, they're going to exit this pandemic looking stronger than ever. And this was one of the great calls of all time, because less than 6 months later, the company was going public.
Yep. I think one of the misnomers with blitzscaling, people just think it means like hire a bunch of people, like go hire. And I actually think like in the era that we're currently in right now, given that many tech companies have gone through significant layoffs, if not one, multiple events over the last couple of years. And now you're starting to see with AI, like Sam Altman said the other day, he believes the first billion-dollar company with one employee is on the horizon in the next 10 years. What do you think? How does it relate to like the number of people? How do you think about that? And how does that apply to blitzscaling and your philosophy around it?
Yeah. So I do believe that AI makes blitzscaling easier in some ways because of the fact that individual human beings can be much more productive than before. I think that it's possible that there will be a billion-dollar company in the next 10 years with one employee, but I don't think it's going to be a major trend because AI can amplify, but there is still extreme value to people working together. And it may be that those groups will be smaller than before, but it may be that there'll be more companies than before. So one of the things I often do is I look to the past. And when I started my first company in the 1990s, to operate an internet company, you had to go and buy a bunch of very expensive Sun Microsystems servers. You had to go spend $500,000 on Oracle software. And you had to go pay Exodus Communications or Global Center $20,000 a month to host all those machines. And that was just what it took to get started. And today, you can do all those things on Amazon Web Services or anything else for like $10 a month. And what did that do? Did that mean that companies no longer have data centers? Everyone just operates off Amazon Web Services? No. It meant that we found ways to use that additional productivity. So AI will dramatically increase productivity. But if we use that productivity to make the world better, make better products, make better services, I have no doubt that we'll find a way to consume it.
Yep, I agree. All right, I want to talk about picking companies. So, obviously the success of an investor is determined by how well they can pick a company. I think one of the things that people don't think enough about as it relates to their own employment is that picking where you work is going to be a huge determinant of your career success. Do you think there's overlap between what investors should be thinking about when they pick companies and what employees should be thinking about when they pick companies?
Absolutely. Now, it's not a complete overlap, but it's still very strong. So from an overlap perspective, the fact remains that if you are part of a winning team, so many benefits accrue. We see this every year in the professional sports world. Like the NFL is playing right now. The teams that are doing well, their offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators will get hired as the next head coaches. The players that are doing well will get a big contract next year. Like being a part of a winning team confers so many benefits. And so if you are an employee, if you're looking out for your own career, obviously you want to be on a rocket ship, not only because it'll provide you with huge amounts of money, potentially, but because it will accelerate your career. It'll be a huge brand value for you. It'll make all these other things possible. So as an individual employee, you should put on your investor hat and try to figure out, do I believe this is going to be a massive success? Now, where there is not as much overlap is the other thing you have to do is you have to ask yourself, who are these people that I'm going to be working with for the next X years? That is really one of the core reasons why you should pick a company. And it's not just because it's going to make the company successful, because these are the people who you are adding to your network, who will be the key collaborators that you are going to work with in the future. And I have made decisions based purely on that point. We were talking before we began recording about our mutual friend, David Weekley. So I worked for David for a while. And here was what I told David when he asked me to join and help him out. Because I told him, I'm not looking to get a job right now. I'm supposed to be taking a quarter off. He's like, I need you. I'm like, okay, David, here's how it's going to work. Here is why I'm going to work for you. It's not for the money, although I hope that we make money here. But what I need from you is I need to connect with a whole younger generation of technologists. Because I know all the VCs. I know many of these key business figures. I come from Harvard Business School and all that. What I am missing is that deep network of people who are technologists, people who are on the cutting edge. And you, David, are really good at bringing those people together. So that's what I'm looking for from you, besides a salary. And he agreed to that and was good to his word. And that's how I met so many of the people in the technology community here in Silicon Valley.
Wow. Yeah, that is such a great way to think about it. People, it's it seems so trite after listening to you talk like that, to when people are always like, oh, go work with good people. But for you, it's actually like you're essentially boiling it down to, what am I optimizing? Like, what is the gap that I need to like really enable greatness? And how can I get this from the next place, from the people that work there? That is so much more specific and helpful for folks. I'm gonna think about that one later, Chris. That's a good one.
Chris, in choosing, these companies, to your point, and I'll speak for myself, probably many others that are listening to this, one of the big drivers is working with the founder, CEO, like that person. What is you work with them for years and years and years, and you've kind of studied them for years. What is your advice on how to suss out whether you're going to get along with, or that's the right founder for you? How do you best assess that?
Yeah, I think that, my hack for doing this is, and it's not always possible. Well, my hack for doing this is to say, okay, well, let's go travel somewhere together.
Wow.
And the reason for that is I find that people can be very good at projecting a certain persona, but they become very challenged at doing so after the 10th hour of the flight, or after you've been sitting in a lounge for 2 hours, or after you've been stuck in traffic. You start to see who the person really is. And I call it the summer camp effect. Another way to do it would be to go to a summer camp, but that is something that it's hard to like get people to agree to. So instead I say travel together. But when you see people under those circumstances where they can no longer, just put up their face and their shields, and where you're seeing the real person, then you get a much better sense of, do I want to spend more time with it?
Oh, I wish I could go back in time and do that.
Holy shit, where have you gone? Where have you gone? Who have you taken? Where have you gone, and who went with you?
Well, so for example, one of my partners at Blitzscaling Ventures, his name is Jeff Abbott. And he originally came into my life because he said, hey, I need help. I'm here at Arizona State. We're running a program with the US military. I need to find a way to recruit entrepreneurs and accelerate them and have them take a look at military technologies and commercialize them. And so we agreed to work together, and he actually set up, a program, and we would travel together to San Diego or Albuquerque, New Mexico, all these places, and spend time together working on things. And he would find a way to make it happen, even though there was not enough time and not enough resources. And I was like, okay, this guy, I can see him under the highest stress circumstances. He can still perform. This is a guy that I need to have somewhere working with me. And so that's how we ended up working together and ultimately forming Blitzscaling Ventures.
I'm just kind of picturing, if I ever take another chief people officer role, saying, I will only sign this offer letter after we go to like Japan together or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Or take a road trip. A road trip would also work, right? You don't a road trip out into the wilderness. Again, the tough part is making it seem like there's a real business purpose behind it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So actually, Kelly, just thinking of our audience. So one of the things I remember back in 2012, 2013, when I was at Google, we were doing all these like anti-bias trainings. And one of the things that they were like really clear on is like, well, you shouldn't assess people. What was that question of like, can I spend, if our flight's delayed 10 hours, can I spend 10 hours at an airport with this person? That was always like a red flag. Like, don't think of it this way. But Chris, like, you seem to be like, no. Like, this is actually like giving me an important signal on working with somebody.
And this is okay, right? This is legal because it's not about whether you're hiring the person. It's about whether you're choosing to work with them.
Yeah. Got it.
And look, I totally understand the intention behind the avoidance of that bias, because it is true that people feel most comfortable with people who are like them. And if you apply that principle blindly, then you will end up hiring people who are like you. And sometimes that might be a good thing. Hey, they also went to Stanford University. That seems to work out pretty well. But other times it doesn't. But this is a little bit different, right? This is all about, okay, I'm now decided that this person is interesting. Now the last step is to figure out, can we actually work together over that extended period of time?
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, I've run into it myself in my own career with, companies I've joined, or been in a company, it's happened to an executive we've hired, or coach others who were like, oh my gosh. And one of the biggest reasons a founder, CEO, and executive relationship does not work out is because of the chemistry and the dynamics. It's not because of the technical and functional skill sets of the hire. It's like, oh, I thought this person was someone else. and boom, and that's so common.
Well, we talk about it all the time, right, Kelly? Like in interviews, we all have this veneer on, and it's like, Chris, Kelly and I've gone super deep on this topic of like interviews are they're very performative.
That's right.
And in fact, like, I don't know actually if we're learning a whole lot of anything that's actually necessary during an interview. I've heard you say before, like the best way to get to know somebody is to get to work with them and just start working with them. And that's also our take. But in a world that right now is oriented around interviews, you have this veneer. And this is where the chemistry problem exists, is like, you don't actually know who this person is and how you're going to be able to work with them, especially in tech when you're going to face challenges. And those challenges are the things that ultimately can either bring you together and make you super tight as a team, or rip you apart and make you realize like, this is a person that's an absolute nightmare to work with.
Chris, one more angle on the founder angle for me, and I think this is a juicy one, because we talk a lot about comp negotiation, and we've done a lot in equity and all that jazz, but we haven't heard what I think you had written down and we talked a little bit about, is negotiating founder shares when you yourself are starting a company. That's a whole nother ball of wax and how that works, because I got to tell you, I don't have any clue either.
Yeah. So let me explain how I got into this to begin with. So I started my first company in 1999. I was at business school and I was convinced that by the time I graduated in June 2000, the boom would be over. And that if I wanted to make a mark in this particular boom, I needed to do something now. And preferably start a company over the summer and sell it before I had to go back to school. But, didn't quite work out that way. I started the company with one of my friends from high school, who fortunately for me and for him had gone on to be one of the first internet millionaires. He had created co-founded a company called Webcom that was a web hosting site, and it was acquired by Vario, which was acquired by NTT, and he walked away as a cash millionaire starting in like 1998 or so. And so 1999 rolls around and we decide we're going to start a company together because we were good friends in high school. And I'm like, I don't have many other friends who are internet millionaires. This seems like a good idea. But he was like, but listen, I'm not the software developer. I'm the operations data center guy. We get a software developer. So we brought on board one of my friends from Stanford, who happened to be in my freshman dorm, who happened to be a brilliant computer scientist, who had won all these awards and things like that. And so that was my introduction. So we had this whole conversation, which was around, okay, well, how much equity am I going to get? And because, first was just the two of us, Thomas and I, we just simply divided up 50-50. I told Thomas, I insisted he take, I can't remember. We insisted that one of us take 1% more. And I think it was probably me that took 1% more because I was originally the idea holder behind it. I was the CEO. But then when our friend, my friend Albert came in, we went online and we looked for what you're supposed to offer someone coming in. And he said, okay, well, how about 5%? And Albert said, well, you guys are super early and you're going to go through a lot of dilution. Albert was a pretty savvy guy. I don't think that's going to work. I'm like, okay, let's think about this. Let's figure out a system that seems fair, because the key to me is decide on the process for making the decision before you get to the numbers. Because the numbers, people will argue about numbers all day long. But if you first get them to agree to the process, then things will be better. And so in that instance, what we did is we had a discussion around, well, what's the right ratio? Since you're coming in later on, what's the right ratio between the holdings of the two initial founders and your founder? What is the level that will feel fair to you? And we sort of came up with this ratio of it should be roughly 3-1. And that's relatively arbitrary, but it's like, okay, we've agreed to that. Then once we do that, we do the math and we say, okay, if we have 3x plus 3x plus 1x is 7x, divide that. Okay, that means that your share should be this percent. And so that's where it ended up being. That's how we made that decision. And then we extended it further because at the end of the summer, I wanted to go back to school, and the people who were involved, the other board members were like, whoa, we need a CEO. So we had to recruit a CEO to come aboard. So we recruited a CEO to come on board, and Jim, who came in as CEO, asked for a certain amount and we agreed to it. And I think in his case, he had asked for 10%, something along those lines. And again, this is a pre-funded startup. So that was actually probably not enough. And in fact, A month or so later, Jim came back to me and said, I think I probably didn't do a good job of negotiating. I think that I probably should have had more. And I said, well, Jim, we have a deal, but I'll tell you what, go back and think about it for a bit. And if you come back to me and tell me that you want to change the deal, we can look into it. But if not, what I would just say is that there was a long time to go in the life of this company. There'd be other opportunities to add, stock options and other things like that. I think that you're going to do well, and we might as well just wait and take care of it later. Because if we open it up now, we got to go to the board and do all this stuff. I think that things will probably work itself out. And he went away, and a couple of days later, he came back and said, I gave my word, and I think you're right. So I'm going to stick with what it is. So in all these cases, the overarching principles are decide on the principles, not the numbers. The numbers come second. Once you agree on the principles, then it's easier to come to agreement on the numbers. It's not always easy. I've done things where I had to get someone to agree. They had a piece of paper that said they had 25% of a company, and I had to get them down as low as possible. And I've had one 8-hour conversation where I was able to get someone from 25% to 6%.
Wow. I mean, 20-something years later, has that process become more formulaic, Chris? Because the stories you're telling are kind of well, this and that. And then, has it become more standard, or is it still kind of open?
I think it's still very much a wild, wild west. Now, look, there are better benchmarks thanks to companies like Carta that can show you how much ownership people have. But the fact is, those are still benchmarks. Every company is a one of one, and you still need to recognize people's feelings. You still need to get them to agree on that process first. And I think that that's my overarching message. Decide on a fair process, and then it's easier to get everyone to accept the outcomes.
Yeah. The process and principles. I love that. And Kelly, this is why companies want to have a compensation philosophy. How do we do compensation here? Let's talk about that first before we get into the numbers, because once you get into the numbers, everything just becomes can I get more? And you don't have any bedrock to which to fall back on of, okay, this is the way that they do things. And there's a method to the madness. And also to your point, Chris, around you are doing deals with people. We don't really view employment agreements as deals, but that's exactly what it is. And when you do a deal with another human, you want to make sure that the deal is based in fairness and it has something of substance underneath it, and numbers are not substance.
Absolutely. But I will share one numbers hack that I got from that CEO, Jim Fitzsimmons, that we mentioned. And it's this. For that company, whenever we prepared a job offer for someone, we came up with a package, which, is typical, right? Here's a salary, here's a stock option package. We would create a version that was more salary heavy and lighter on stock. And we create a version that was less salary heavier and heavier on stock. Because you don't know what a person's indifference curve is. And you doing your best to put together what you think is fair. But if you make those three options along your indifference curve, and they pick one of the ones that you didn't expect them to pick, you just created value.
I love that.
Chris, you're an absolute legend. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I learned a ton from this conversation, and I know our audience is going to as well.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Well, it is a delight. Hopefully I was able to maintain my energy throughout, and please feel free to have me come on again. I don't know if you've used up all my fun of stories, but we can always find out.
I highly doubt that.
There's more Riz to squeeze for sure.
You got it. Squeeze that Riz, baby.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.